The snow was falling like ash, soft and endless over a city that had forgotten what warmth felt like. It was January 1943, the 900th day of hunger, and in Leningrad, death had become as common as the cold. Along the frozen banks of the Neva River, figures moved like shadows through the drifts. Soldiers, mothers, children bundled in rags. Their faces were hollow, eyes glazed not from fear but from exhaustion. Every breath crystallized into the air like smoke from an invisible fire. Beneath them, the ice groaned, a sound that could have been the river or the earth itself mourning the dead. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled across the frozen horizon, the German guns of Army Group North still shelling the city that refused to die. Yet tonight something was different. A low vibration trembled through the ice, not from bombardment but from engines, Soviet tanks, rumbling across the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga, headlights covered with slits of cloth crawling toward the city like phantoms. In their path, convoys of trucks carried sacks of flour, tins of meat, boxes of ammunition, life itself, finally moving through the same road that had claimed thousands in the months before. Inside the city, in the shattered shell of the Smolny Institute, a radio operator huddled over her console, fingers numb, waiting for the signal. Her headphones crackled, the voice faint but real. To all units, the blockade is broken. She froze, tears welling for the first time in years. Outside bells began to ring, not from churches, most of which had been turned into morgues, but from factories and ships frozen in the harbor. The people of Leningrad, starved, skeletal, barely alive, stepped into the streets and wept, the snow mixing with tears, their faces lit by the faint orange glow of dawn over a city that had outlasted death itself. The winter of 1941 fell on Leningrad like a sentence passed by history itself, slow and merciless. By November, the city was sealed, no rail, no road, no mercy. German and Finnish forces had drawn a noose 875 kilometers long around 3 million souls, and inside that iron ring, the air itself seemed to thin. The first to die were the weak, the infants, the sick, the old, but soon strength became meaningless, for the city itself was starving. The food depots at Badaev, once filled with grain and sugar, had been obliterated by air raids, and for months afterward the snow there still smelled faintly of burnt bread. Rations shrank until they became insults. 125 grams of bread per day, half made from sawdust and wallpaper paste, black and bitter, yet still fought over. People learned to boil glue scraped from furniture for soup, to chew leather belts softened in water, to strip bark from trees and call it tea. In every apartment block, the same routine: morning frost thick on the inside of windows, ice forming in kitchen basins, a candle flickering as someone measured breadcrumbs like gold dust. And outside, the city sank into silence. Trams frozen in the middle of Nevsky Prospect stood like tombs. Horses fell and were stripped for meat before they cooled. Dogs disappeared. Then the cats. Then even the rats. Death was not sudden. It crept quietly, politely, like a guest waiting for permission to enter. Families would sit around a table, hands folded, and one by one the heads would lower into sleep that did not end. The streets filled with sleds carrying the dead to Piskaryovskoye Cemetery, where the ground was too hard to dig, so bodies were stacked like wood until thaw. Yet even as the city withered, its heart beat stubbornly on. In the Kirov factory, women too weak to stand still turned lathes, machining tank parts with fingers blue from frost. In the Philharmonic Hall, Shostakovich composed his Seventh Symphony by candlelight, its notes written on paper so brittle it crumbled at his touch. And on the frozen Neva, anti-aircraft crews fired into the dark sky at bombers they could not see, each burst of flak briefly lighting the faces of soldiers who had not eaten in days but still refused to bow. Leningrad became less a city than an idea, an island of defiance drifting in a sea of death. When the Germans shelled the food warehouses again in December, one shell fell into a crowd waiting for bread. The survivors did not run. They simply brushed off the snow, stepped over the bodies, and waited for the line to move again. There was no fear left, only endurance. Each dawn arrived weaker than the last, pale and cold, as if the sun itself were rationed. On New Year's Eve, the loudspeakers in Palace Square played Shostakovich's Slavonic March through the static, and a small crowd gathered despite the air raid sirens. They stood silently as the music rose above the ruins, the wind carrying it out toward the German lines. Somewhere beyond those frozen fields, a Wehrmacht officer heard it and wrote in his diary, "They are starving, but they are not breaking." Inside the city, rumors spread that spring would come soon, that the ice road across Lake Ladoga, the road of life, would reopen, that food was on its way. But for now, winter reigned like a tyrant that refused to die. The thermometer dropped to -40. Fires froze in chimneys. The stars themselves looked like shards of glass. And in the dim light of another hopeless dawn, an old woman walking through the snow to find water paused, listened to the rumble of distant guns, and whispered into the wind, "They can surround us, but they cannot enter." By January 1942, Leningrad was less a city than a frozen tomb surrounded by fire. Yet across the great white silence of Lake Ladoga there existed one thread, thin as a hair, between life and extinction. They called it Doroga Zhizny, the road of life, a name that sounded almost cruel when first spoken because it was made of ice, death's own material. The lake stretched 60 miles across, frozen solid in the fierce Siberian cold, but the ice could never be trusted. Beneath it waited the black water, silent and patient, swallowing convoys without trace. Yet it was the only route left. The siege had choked every railway and road, so when the Soviet High Command ordered supplies into the city, there was no choice but to drive them over the lake itself. The first trucks rolled out under darkness, their headlights hooded, engines muffled with cloth, the men inside clutching icons and good luck charms. They moved slowly, 20 meters apart, because the ice groaned under each axle. To the drivers it felt as if the lake were breathing, each creak a warning, each pop like the crack of a rifle. Bombers came in daylight, black crosses against a sky the color of iron, dropping bombs that shattered the ice into geysers of steam. When that happened, the drivers simply veered around the holes, steering through mist that smelled of oil and blood. Their tires sprang shards of frozen water like glass. The trucks carried everything: flour, sugar, ammunition, sometimes even children evacuated from the city, wrapped in blankets, too weak to cry. Many never made it across. The ice swallowed them soundlessly, the lake closing above their heads, the bubbles freezing before they reached the surface. But still they came, night after night, guided by the glow of flares on the far shore, the drivers counting each kilometer like a prayer. On the return trips, the trucks were filled not with supplies but with the living ghosts of Leningrad. Orphans, nurses, soldiers too frostbitten to fight, faces gray with hunger, eyes already halfway to death. One nurse, Valentina Afanasieva, later wrote, "The ice sang beneath us. It was a song of sorrow, but also of hope. Hope was all they had. On the Leningrad side, unloading brigades waited in the blizzard, skeletal men and women who could barely lift the sacks but still formed human chains to carry them into the city." The first flour arrived on February 7, 1942. The same day, bakeries reopened. Though no one could taste what they made, bread now consisted of 60% cellulose, 20% sawdust, 10% clay, and the rest, if one was lucky, flour. But it was bread, and it meant survival. For the first time in months, people smiled, though their lips cracked from the cold. Children in orphanages received tiny pieces wrapped in paper like treasure, holding them in their hands for hours before daring to eat. The road of life became a pulse, beating weakly but steadily, and with it came the promise that the city might endure another season. Yet the cost was terrible. Over 6,000 drivers died that winter. The average lifespan of a Ladoga trucker was 12 days. Entire convoys vanished when the ice shifted beneath artillery shockwaves, leaving only ripples frozen mid-motion. Still, replacements volunteered every week, many of them teenagers barely 16, because to drive that road was to fight back, to defy the siege. At the lake's northern edge, engineers worked in freezing wind to lay cables and pipelines beneath the ice, lifelines of oil and communication, so that even if the trucks failed, the city would still breathe. They built under fire, shells striking the lake in thunderous fountains, yet somehow the lines held. By spring, Leningrad had received 45,000 tons of supplies, and though the people remained starving, the spark of survival had been rekindled. When the thaw came, the road of life disappeared back into the water as if it had never existed, leaving only the echoes of engines beneath the wind. But those who had crossed it never forgot the sound, the crack and moan of the ice beneath tires, the endless horizon of white, the feeling of driving not upon a road but between worlds. Later, soldiers would say that the lake was haunted, That on still nights you could hear trucks moving out there long after the ice was gone, the ghosts of the convoys still traveling back and forth, carrying bread and hope between life and death. Time lost meaning in Leningrad. There was only hunger, cold, and endurance. The days measured not by sunrise or sunset, but by whether one's heart still beat at dusk. 900 days, 900 endless, shivering dawns, each one beginning with the sound of distant artillery and ending with silence heavy enough to crush thought. The city became an organism of suffering, its veins the frozen canals, its bones the bridges now wrapped in barbed wire, its breath visible in the frigid air. Children learned to distinguish the sounds of different shells, the whistlers, the screamers, the ones that never land. When a bomb hit, the snow fell again, not white but gray with ash. In those months, death lost ceremony. It became routine. People died sitting on benches, waiting for bread rations that never came. Mothers carried their children's bodies wrapped in blankets, too weak to cry. And yet through all of it, the city refused to collapse. Theaters reopened, staging plays in basements lit by oil lamps. The Philharmonic Orchestra performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony on August 9, 1942, in a hall surrounded by German guns. The musicians were so starved they had to be carried to their chairs, but they played. Every note an act of rebellion, every bow stroke a declaration that life itself was defying annihilation. Outside, Soviet loudspeakers broadcast the concert toward the German lines, the music rolling across no man's land like the voice of a civilization that refused to be erased. One German officer later wrote, "When I heard it, I knew we could never take the city." Inside the ruins, people began carving tiny shrines from ice and candle wax, setting them by windows as if to remind the world that they still existed. Hospitals overflowed with frostbite and starvation. Nurses too weak to stand leaning against walls as they worked, hands trembling, eyes hollow. Yet even then the city fought. Women at anti-aircraft guns, students manning telegraph lines, engineers repairing power grids with bare fingers. The factories never stopped. The Kirov plant turned out tanks whose steel came from melted church bells and tram rails, weapons born from the bones of the city itself. The Germans bombarded water stations, food depots, hospitals, even cemeteries, but could not kill the will of a people who had already made peace with death. Letters from the front trickled in, smudged with soot and blood, speaking of hope that no one believed but everyone needed. One mother, her fingers too swollen from cold to hold a pen, dictated to her daughter, "We live because we remember who we were." That sentence became a kind of anthem whispered through the city's ruins. Still, the hunger deepened. By winter of 1942, reports of cannibalism spread quietly through the streets, unspoken but understood. The NKVD posted signs warning of cases of extreme desperation, though everyone knew what that meant. The bread lines grew shorter, not because there was more food, but because there were fewer mouths left to feed. And yet somehow the will endured. Every morning, workers gathered by the frozen Neva to clear snow from the tram rails, though no trams had moved in months. Every night, searchlights swept the sky over the blacked-out city, tracing invisible arcs of defiance. When spring finally came, it brought no warmth, only the thawing of thousands of bodies from the snowbanks, each one a story, a face, a loss, but also the faint green of grass pushing through rubble. Life impossibly persisted. On May 1, 1943, for the first time in 2 years, a parade marched down Nevsky Prospect. Not soldiers, but factory workers, teachers, nurses, carrying banners that read, "For Leningrad." "For life!" The crowd wept as they walked because they knew they had not won, only survived. Still, that was enough. From the German trenches across the Volkhov front, the besiegers watched through binoculars as the starving city held its parade, and one of them murmured, "They are not human, they are something stronger." The siege had not yet lifted, but its spirit had already broken. Within that city of shadows and ghosts, a light had begun to burn that no winter, no hunger, no army could extinguish. By the end of 1942, Leningrad was a city suspended between life and extinction, frozen, starving, yet still breathing defiance through every broken window and snow-choked street. Beyond its southern outskirts, the front line lay frozen too, a scar of trenches and shell holes stretching from the Neva River to the forests of Sinyavino, where the Red Army had been battering against the German lines for more than a year without success. Stalin demanded the impossible, that the blockade be broken before the city's third winter. And so, in the bleak dawn of January 12, 1943, under a sky the color of iron, the guns of the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts opened fire in unison. 20,000 shells in the first minute. The snow leapt like surf under the impact. For 2 hours the bombardment continued, turning the German fortifications into a churning ocean of smoke and debris. Then, as silence fell, Soviet infantry rose from the trenches, the 67th and 2nd Shock Armies, gray figures moving through fog, bayonets fixed, their faces wrapped in white scarves stiff with frost. The operation was called Iskra, Spark, and for those men it was not just a name but a prayer. The German 170th Infantry Division dug in along the narrow corridor between the southern shore of Lake Ladoga and the village of Schlisselburg, met them with machine gun fire, bullets tracing invisible nets across the snow. Men fell in dozens, their bodies vanishing into the drifts, but the advance did not stop. Soviet sappers crawled forward with mines and satchel charges, throwing themselves against bunkers to clear the path. Overhead, artillery screamed from both sides of the river, the sound so loud it felt like the sky itself was cracking. In the chaos, a T-34 battalion pushed through the ice road, its treads sparking fire against frozen metal, each tank marked with names scrawled in chalk: Leningrad, Revenge, Mother. For the soldiers inside, it was more than a battle. It was a pilgrimage home. On the 13th day, as the fighting closed around Schlisselburg, a reconnaissance unit of the 136th Rifle Division stumbled through the smoke and saw, through the haze, Soviet soldiers approaching from the east, men of the 18th Rifle Division of the Volkhov Front. For a heartbeat, they froze, unable to believe it. Then one soldier lifted a red flag torn to ribbons and waved it above his head. The two groups met in the ruins of the settlement, embracing through tears, their rifles clattering into the snow. After 872 days, the siege was broken. The corridor was only 10 kilometers wide, barely a ribbon through the swamp, but it was enough. Within days, engineers laid the first temporary rail line across the frozen ground, a single track guarded by machine guns and camouflage nets. On February 7, 1943, the first train rolled into Leningrad. Its engine, blackened by frost, bore a red banner that read simply, "To the heroes of the city." Crowds gathered along the tracks, thin as shadows, weeping silently as the wagons passed. Flour, sugar, meat, medicine, words that had become dream, now rumbling through the heart of the starving city. In the Smolny Institute, loudspeakers announced, "Comrades, the blockade has been broken." For a moment, the entire city seemed to exhale. Factory whistles blew. Church bells rang, though their towers were cracked. Soldiers fired rifles into the air, not in battle but celebration. Some fell to their knees, unable to stand from weakness, laughing and sobbing at once. In the harbor, icebound sailors stood on decks and saluted the east, their faces streaked with tears that froze where they fell. For the first time in nearly 2.5 years, bread rations increased, and the bakeries, once symbols of despair, filled the air with the faint, sweet scent of life. Yet the victory was not complete. The Germans still held the southern approaches, and the city remained under fire for another year. But the spell was broken. Hope, that most dangerous and necessary of things, had returned. The next morning, children gathered in the streets to scrape snow off the train tracks, their laughter ringing like music in the air. Leningrad was still a ruin, still starving, still scarred, but it was alive. The frozen river reflected a pale sun, and for the first time since the siege began, people began to believe in tomorrow. Somewhere on the front, a gun crew painted new words on the barrel of their howitzer, "For those who endured." January 27, 1944, the day the world had almost stopped believing would come, dawned gray and silent over Leningrad, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. The siege had lasted 872 days. Nearly 1 million had died, most without graves, their names carried only by the wind. Yet this morning the air was different. Somewhere beyond the southern front, the thunder of Soviet artillery rolled like a promise. Not destruction, but deliverance. For weeks the Red Army had been pushing west in the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, grinding through the German 18th Army, forcing them to retreat from their frozen entrenchments near Pushkin, Kolpino, and Rapsha. The city's defenders, the same soldiers who had eaten glue, fought on empty stomachs, and watched their families vanish into hunger. now advanced through the very minefields that had imprisoned them for nearly 2.5 years. Every street, every trench, every shattered factory wall was part of the final push. By mid-morning, the Germans were in full retreat, their lines collapsing like brittle ice, leaving behind scorched earth and wrecked guns. In Smolny, the command center of the city, General Leonid Govorov, commander of the Leningrad front, received the message. All enemy resistance south of the city has ceased. The siege is lifted. He did not cheer. He simply removed his cap, placed it on the table, and stood in silence for a long moment before saying, "Inform the people." Outside, the announcement spread like fire through frostbitten streets. Loudspeakers crackled to life on lampposts, the same ones that had once delivered air raid warnings and death lists, now proclaiming something no one dared to dream. Comrades, today, January 27th, our Leningrad has been completely liberated from the enemy blockade. For a heartbeat, there was no sound. Then, as if the city inhaled at once, a roar erupted. Bells rang from every surviving church, factory whistles screamed, and from the ruins came voices, hoarse, weak, but alive. People poured into the streets, staggering through snow and torn coats, holding one another like survivors of a shipwreck seeing shore for the first time. Soldiers embraced civilians, nurses wept into their frozen hands, old men saluted the sky. In the center of the city, by the bronze equestrian statue of Peter the Great, the bronze horseman, a small crowd gathered despite the cold. Some knelt, others sang the anthem, their voices cracking but defiant, echoing across the Neva like the sound of resurrection. At 8 p.m., the city darkened again, not for fear of air raids but for memory. Searchlights flickered on across the frozen river, tracing upward until they formed a vast dome of light, a cathedral made of fire. Then came the sound. A single artillery shell fired from the Aurora, the ship that had once signaled revolution, now signaling survival. It was the first of 24 salvos from 324 guns, one for each month of the siege. The explosions rolled across the night sky, illuminating the snow like daylight. The people stood in silence, their faces lifted toward the light, tears freezing on their cheeks. Some whispered the names of the dead. Some simply stared. When the final gun thundered, it was as if the city exhaled at last, releasing 2 years of grief in a single breath. For the survivors, the war was not over. The front still raged westward toward Narva and the Baltic. But in Leningrad, something greater than victory had been achieved. The impossible had been endured. That night, the bakeries worked through the dark hours, producing loaves with real flour for the first time since 1941. The smell drifted through the streets, thick and sweet, mingling with the smoke of fireworks and gunpowder. People followed the scent like pilgrims, forming lines not from desperation but from disbelief. Soldiers handed out bread to children who held it as if afraid it might vanish. A girl named Nina Voronina, age 11, later wrote in her diary, "We did not eat it at once. We only smelled it. It was the smell of peace." In hospitals, patients too weak to rise asked nurses to open the windows so they could hear the bells and breathe the cold night air. Proof that they were still alive, that the city still stood. Across the river, in the Kirov factory, the workers who had built tanks with numb fingers now stood atop them, waving flags torn from bedsheets, their laughter echoing off the shattered walls. Everywhere, portraits of Stalin and Lenin were raised. But the true saints of Leningrad were its people, the mothers who boiled wallpaper for soup, the drivers who crossed Ladoga, the children who carried water through shell fire, the soldiers who froze in trenches so the city could breathe one more day. As dawn broke on January 28th, sunlight spilled across the ruins, touching the spires of the Admiralty and the domes of St. Isaac's Cathedral. It was the same city, yet unrecognizable, scarred, hollowed, half-buried, but alive. Survivors emerged from basements they had lived in for years, blinking against the brightness. The air smelled faintly of smoke, metal, and snow, the scent of a world reborn. Along the Nevsky Prospect, flags appeared in shattered windows, stitched from curtains, tablecloths, even bandages. On the frozen Neva, children skated for the first time, not to gather firewood or corpses, but to play. Their laughter carried through the ruins like music. It was said that on that morning the sun seemed to rise slower than usual, as if savoring its first full day over a free city. But freedom came with ghosts. Everywhere one looked, the reminders of hunger, frost, and loss were carved into stone and flesh alike. Of the 3 million people who had lived in Leningrad before the siege, fewer than 1 in 3 remained. The rest lay beneath the snow, beneath the streets, or beneath the ice of Ladoga, a million unmarked graves. Yet even in grief, the survivors refused to spare. At the Piskaryovskoye cemetery, they began to bury the dead properly at last. The earth was still frozen, so shovels clanged like bells. They worked in silence, lining the graves with pine branches, laying the bodies of mothers beside their children, soldiers beside factory workers, all equal now in death. Above them, a banner read, "No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten." Those words would later be carved into stone, but for the people that day, they were still raw truth, a vow more sacred than prayer. In the days that followed, trains thundered into the city carrying not weapons but wheat. Food depots reopened, ration cards increased, and electricity flickered back into life. Streetcars moved again for the first time since 1941, their bells echoing through avenues where silence had once ruled. Soldiers returning from the front found their homes reduced to rubble, yet still embraced the ruins as if they were mansions. Leningrad began to breathe again, painfully, slowly, like a body thawing after near death. Artists painted on cardboard when canvas ran out. Writers scrawled memoirs in margins of ration books, and musicians tuned instruments rescued from basements where they had been hidden from bombs. The first post-siege concert in the Philharmonic Hall played not Shostakovich but Tchaikovsky, the Pathétique, a requiem and a rebirth at once. The audience stood through the entire performance because sitting felt too much like resting when the dead could not. Outside the city, the Red Army pressed on. The same men who had liberated Leningrad now drove the Germans west, through snow and forest fueled by vengeance and memory. For them, every shell fired was an answer to every child who had starved, every mother who had frozen in the dark. On their tanks they painted names, Leningrad, Nevsky, Victory, and carried bits of the city's rubble as talismans. The battle lines moved farther and farther away, but the sound of artillery still echoed faintly across the Neva, like a heartbeat reminding the survivors that the war was not yet over. Still, within the city limits there was peace, fragile, trembling, miraculous. In February, a photographer from Pravda captured an image that would become legend, a woman standing alone in Palace Square, her coat too large, a loaf of bread clutched to her chest, eyes closed as sunlight touched her face. She had survived the entire siege. When asked her name, she said, "What does it matter? I am Leningrad." That photograph would later hang in classrooms across the Soviet Union, a symbol not of victory but of endurance, the quiet, unyielding strength that outlasted both bombs and starvation. For years after, those who lived through it would dream of the siege as if it were still happening. The sound of distant guns, the gnawing emptiness, the endless snow. Many could not throw away scraps of food without guilt. Others saved candle stubs, convinced darkness would return. In 1945, when the war finally ended, the city celebrated again. But this time the joy was quieter. Leningrad had not triumphed in the way battles are won. It had endured, and endurance is its own kind of victory. In 1961, the Soviet government renamed the medal awarded to siege survivors as the Medal for the Defense of Leningrad, and thousands of thin, stooped veterans lined up to receive it, wearing the same tattered coats they had fought in. Among them was Valentina Afanasyeva, one of the nurses who had crossed the road of life in 1942. When a journalist asked her what she remembered most, she smiled faintly and said, "The silence after the last shell fell. It was the loudest sound I have ever heard." And even now, decades later, the city still remembers. The people still lay flowers at the eternal flame in Piskaryovskoye, where the inscription reads, "Here lie the people of Leningrad. We cannot name them all, but we remember them." Each year on January 27th, the sirens that once warned of bombers wail again, not for danger, but remembrance. Traffic halts, the city falls silent. In that silence, one can almost hear the wind moving through the empty corridors of the past, carrying the voices of those who endured, the children who never grew up, the mothers who refused to surrender, the soldiers who fought on starvation and hope. And when the last note of the memorial trumpet fades over the Neva, it is as if the whole city exhales once more, not in grief, but in gratitude for the miracle of survival. Because Leningrad was never merely defended, it was resurrected. The siege did not break it, it revealed it. Beneath the hunger, the frost, the bombs, there was something indestructible. The spirit of a people who learned to live without everything except courage. That spirit still lingers in the cobblestones, in the iron bridges, in the echo of footsteps through Palace Square on winter mornings. It lingers in the smell of fresh bread from Nevsky bakeries, in the laughter of schoolchildren skating on the Neva where the road of life once lay. It lingers every time the city's bells ring through the snow, each note an echo of that night in 1944, when light rose from darkness and the people of Leningrad, gaunt but unbroken, finally stood tall under a free sky.